This month I have been trying to focus on getting a lot of those unfinished projects that I have in my sewing space completed. And I've noticed a lot of them are really close to being finished. I have a few quilts that really just need binding on them. A few days ago, I shared my super simple and easy binding method by sewing machine. So now I want to share with you my binding method that is by hand, or at least half by hand. I honestly used to tell myself I would never sew a binding on by hand because I just don't love hand sewing, or at least I didn't think I love hand sewing. I'm really starting to become a huge fan of it. One of the things I love about sewing a binding on by hand is that I can sit wherever I want to and get nice and cozy and sew it on. I could watch TV while I sew it on. I don't have to be up in my sewing space at a sewing machine. Now, I love being at a sewing machine, but I can't watch a movie with my family at the sewing machine. So it's kind of nice to have something just to sit and stitch with my family. Another reason that I love sewing the binding on by hand is that I don't feel that it's as hard on my body as sitting on at the sewing machine and trying to maneuver a larger quilt through the machine. I can find myself getting a lot of stress in my shoulders while I'm holding everything up, and I have found that it's a lot less stressful and a lot more relaxing for me to sit somewhere comfortable and hand stitch a binding on. Another thing I've noticed that has been a quite pleasant surprise for me is how clean a hand sewn binding looks compared to how well I can do machine stitching the binding on. So here's one that I just did by machine. This is the one that I showed putting the machine binding on. Now I love to do a 2.5-inch binding that I sew onto the back with a 1/4-inch seam and then flip to the front and stitch down. Now you can do a thinner binding, absolutely. But for me, I've tried doing a 2 1/4-inch binding strip and doing this machine sewn version to get a thinner binding, and it's really hard for me to be comfortable stitching it on that way. There's just not a lot of wiggle room, and for me, I don't love that way of binding. But doing the 2.5-inch, I always get this wider binding that just sometimes doesn't work on a quilt. If I have a border on the quilt, it will pretty much, always work out fine. But if I have, say, points of a star that come right to the edge of the quilt, this binding method that I do can cover up those points. And I don't feel it always works for every quilt the way I like to sew on a binding. So the hand sewn binding has worked really well for that when I really want the quilt top to shine and I don't want the binding to get in any of the design features on the quilt. So what I mean is when I flip this back, because I sewed it on a 1/4 inch and I flip it to the back, I'm going to have a nice thin binding through here. And I feel like that will highlight some of my quilts a lot better than a thicker binding, just depending on the design. So I love being able to pick and choose which binding method I want to use and which will work best for my quilt top. Now, when I am hand sewing on a binding, I've tried a few different methods. I'm going to show you the method that I love the best, and I'll kind of talk you through why I have come to like this method the best. Now, I've tried gluing my binding to the back of the quilt and then stitching it down. So I would flip it, use whatever glue I like to use. I normally use a glue stick or the Acorn Precision glue, and then I'll iron it down. So I've just flipped it, gone all the way around, slowly gluing and ironing the binding so that the glue dries a little bit faster, and then I would stitch my binding on. Now, the reason I quit doing that is because I have found that if I get the glue too close to the edge of the binding gets really stiff and it makes it a lot harder to get my needle through, a lot harder to get nice clean stitches. So I stopped using that method. Now all I do is just add some Wonder clips on, and I only grab a handful. So right now I just have 4. So wherever I'm going to start, I'll put a few in to hold the binding in place for me. The reason I don't go around the whole quilt is, one, because I don't want to use up all my clips on one project. And 2, I have found that they can just fall off. When I'm moving it around, I'll hit them, especially if I'm sitting, you know, on the couch or something like that. I have it all laying all over me, and I'll kick the Wonder clips off, and then I'll have to go pick them up, find them, worry about the dog grabbing them, whatever. So I just put a few on where I'm going to be working, and I move them along as needed. With the method that I am using for needle and thread, I just use whatever needle I find, honestly, just one that feels comfortable for me to hold. And then for thread, I have found that I don't even really have to get a thread color that matches perfectly with my quilt, because the threads really end up hidden really well with this method. So I'm just going to use the white thread because I'm hoping it will show up a little better for you with this black. It probably isn't going to show up because you kind of hide the threads, but I was hoping it would show up decently. Now, I got a lot of thread off here because I double up my thread. I know that it is in a way wasting thread that I don't need to double it up. The reason I double it up is because then my needle won't fall off. If I am in the middle of working on something and I need to get up and go work on something else, go do something, I don't have to worry about my needle falling off and losing it in the couch, on the floor, anything like that. It's going to stay attached to where I'm working. I do have magnets to put them on and all that, but this has just been a lifesaver, just keeping it like this so I don't lose it. And then 2, while I'm sewing, I don't have to be as careful to make sure that it just doesn't fall off when I'm sewing. So that's the reason I've started just doubling my thread. So I just put the messiest knot possible in here because I was paying attention, but it'll work. It's strong. Now all I'm going to do is sink this messy knot into the quilt to start sewing. So I'm going to turn this because I like to have the edge of the binding facing me. And I'm just going to pick somewhere. Now I'm going to start next to this clip here, and this clip is going to stay in as I work all the way around the quilt because it kind of gives me a guide as to how much more I still have to do. It'll let me know where I started, and I just love leaving one there so I know how much work I've done. Now I'm just gonna put the needle in so that it's gonna come up around where I want to start sewing, and I'm just sinking the needle under the top of the bottom of the quilt and into the batting. So I'm not going to push it through to the other side. And then I'm just going to come up right next to the binding there. So I'm just going to pull it through. I'm going to pop that into the quilt, and a little bit of it's hanging out because I did such a horrible job with that knot. But the great thing about it is no matter what, the knot is going to work, whether it's pretty or not. All right, so I can feel that it's all stuck in here into the binding and not popping through. So I'm just gonna start sewing. Now, since I'm on the back of the quilt, now I wanna grab some of the binding. So what I do is just go into the binding just a little bit, under 1/4 of an inch. Between 1/4 and 1/8 of an inch, I'll go through the binding. So I pick up just a little bit of it. Then I'm gonna pull through. And then I'm going to sink into the back of the quilt just a little. I'm just going to pick up just a little bit of the back of the quilt, about that same amount, under 1/4 of an inch, but not under 1/8 of an inch. So somewhere between there. I'm not going through to the front of the quilt, just a little bit of the back of the quilt and pull through. And then you can see just a little hint of the stitches, but they really don't stand out. Once you pull it a little tighter, they can really start to hide. And when I have been doing this a while, it's been a while since I've stitched on a quilt, the binding onto a quilt. But when I get going, I start going fairly fast, and I find that the stitches hide more and more. I feel like when I'm just starting off again, I'm kind of not in the groove of it, but they really can get hidden really well if you are careful with where you grab the binding and where you sink into the back of the quilt. So I'm going to grab a little bit of the binding, pull through, and I'm grabbing the back of the quilt right under where the stitch comes out of the binding at, and just a little bit at a time. But you probably can't even, I can see some of the stitches just a little bit, but they really hide well this method. So that's really it. That's how you go around the whole binding. When you get to corners, I just fold them down and stitch around the corner. You can add a few stitches across the mitered, edge if you want to. But that's essentially it. When I run out of thread, I'll tie a knot close to the end here of the thread, as close to the quilt as I can get, and I just sink that into the quilt, and I'll start a new thread just like I did here. It's really a lot easier to sew on the binding than I thought it would be. So I'm just going to keep stitching this binding on. I hope it's a method that you decide to give a try to, because I really think it is relaxing. Now, of course, if you have any issues with your hands whatsoever and using a needle and hand sewing just doesn't work for you, of course, that is completely understandable. But if you are able to, I highly recommend just giving it a try. I was adamantly against hand sewing on a binding, and after I gave it a try, I really saw all the benefits to sewing it on. And possibly the idea of trying a new way to sew on a binding may be the motivation that you need to finish up one of those unfinished projects that you may have. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.